Every single time a student logs into a classroom app, they're leaving a digital footprint. And that brings up a really big question, right? Who's actually watching over all that data? Well, in this explainer, we're going to peel back the layers on this super complex system of rules that's supposed to protect student privacy.
So here's what we're going to do. Think of it kind of like a funnel. We'll start big at the very top with federal law. Then we'll narrow it down to the challenges that states are dealing with. And finally, we'll zoom all the way in to see how one specific school district actually makes these privacy rules work in the real world, day in and day out.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Protecting Kids Online with COPPA. This is really the foundation of digital privacy for children.
Okay, so you have to wonder, where do these rules even come from? I mean, who makes the rules of the road for kids' info online? It turns out the starting point, the absolute baseline, it all comes down to a single federal law. And that baseline is called COPPA. That stands for the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. It's enforced by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and it's the rule that says, hey, if you've got a website or an app that's aimed at kids under 13, you absolutely have to get a parent's permission before you collect their personal data. It's really the bedrock of digital privacy for young kids here in the U.S.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, the Data Collection Challenge. Now, this is where things get interesting, because this is where we start to see the gap between the rules on paper and what happens in reality.
So here's the fundamental problem for schools. On one hand, federal law requires them to collect tons of data. I'm talking everything from tracking students in foster care to reporting graduation rates. But here's the challenge. They're often stuck using multiple totally disconnected systems. And as you can imagine, that creates a complete nightmare of doing the same work over and over and dealing with really clunky data formats. So how do you even begin to fix a mess like that? Well, let's look at Colorado. They tackled this problem head-on with something they call the data pipeline. Instead of making everyone juggle all these different systems, they just built one secure platform for everything. And this one change had massive effects. It seriously cut down on repetitive data entry, it let staff fix errors online in real time, and maybe most importantly, it meant they could finally focus on the student, tracking what they need even if they move to a different district. All right, Section 3, a school district's playbook. We've seen the federal law, we've seen a state-level solution. Now let's zoom all the way in and see how this all works on the ground, where all this policy actually becomes practice.
So for our case study, we're going to look at School Administrative Unit number 6. We'll just call it SAU number 6. It serves 2 communities up in New Hampshire. And the reason we're looking at them is because they've put together this incredibly detailed data and privacy governance plan. It gives us a perfect window into how data protection really works at the local level.
A really critical part of the SAU #6 plan is just how they think about data. See, for them, it's not just something you collect and forget about. No, data has a whole life cycle. And they have mapped out every single step of that journey, from the moment they identify a need for some data to how it's created, stored, used, and eventually how it's securely destroyed. And think about it. To protect data the right way, you have to know what kind of data you're even dealing with. Makes sense, right? So SAU 6 is really smart about this. They classify all their data into 4 different levels. It ranges from the most sensitive stuff, which they call PII, or Personally Identifiable Information, all the way down to basic public information. And this simple classification system is what tells them exactly how to handle and secure each piece of data, every step of the way. Okay, let's get super practical for a second. We've all seen it, right? The explosion of educational apps and online tools in the classroom. I mean, they're everywhere. But that brings up a huge critical question. Who is actually checking these things? Who decides if these tools are safe enough for our kids to use? Well, SAU #6 is crystal clear on this point. Their own governance plan is so explicit, a teacher can't just wake up and decide to use some new cool-looking app. Every single tool, even if it's free, has to go through a formal vetting process before it gets anywhere near a student. And we're not talking about some informal check-in either. This is a full-blown, formal, 5-step process. It kicks off with a staff member making a request. Then that tool gets rigorously vetted. They look at the privacy policy, who owns the data, the security measures. After that, the data governance team actually reviews the fine print on the contract. Only then is it approved or denied. The whole system is built to find any potential risks before an app makes it into the classroom.
So who's the person in charge of all this? That's where the Information Security Officer, or ISO, comes in. This is the key role. In the case of SAU 6, it's their Director of Technology. This person is ultimately responsible for creating the security policies, for reviewing those contracts, and for giving the final thumbs up or thumbs down on new tools. It creates a single, clear point of accountability. The buck stops there.
And the job isn't done just because an app gets approved. The oversight keeps going. The district also has a digital learning specialist who's constantly on the lookout, tracking how these tools are actually being used in the classroom. And if they spot any misuse that could potentially expose student information, they report it. It really makes data protection an ongoing, living process, not a one-and-done checklist.
All right, Section 5. Data privacy, what's next? Let's bring this all home and put it all together. So what's the big takeaway here? What have we really seen? I think it's that real student privacy, it's not about one single law. It's really a chain of responsibility. It starts with that federal foundation, a law like COPPA. Then it gets translated into practical, workable systems by states, like what we saw in Colorado. But it only becomes truly effective when a local district like SAU number 6 rolls up its sleeves, creates a super detailed playbook, and then, this is key, puts a specific person, like an information security officer, in charge of actually running it.
Look, the frameworks we've just walked through are absolutely essential. But we all know that technology, especially with the explosion of AI in the classroom, is not standing still for a second. So that leaves us with the real forward-looking question, doesn't it? As this pace of innovation just keeps accelerating, what is it truly going to take to protect a child's digital life in the classrooms of tomorrow?